Have you ever felt just utterly alone, abandoned maybe, like your identity, your very sense of who you are has just been wiped away?
It's a really unsettling feeling to even think about.
It is. But today, in this deep dive, we're going to explore that feeling through a really unexpected lens. The figure of the forsaken woman, particularly how this idea shows up in the context of human trafficking.
Yeah, and what's surprising maybe is how much insight this perspective actually offers. Not just about, societal injustice, which is obviously huge, but also something really fundamental about identity itself
Yeah.
and how it can be restored.
Right. So our mission here is to explore this concept, the forsaken woman, drawing from an academic paper that really tackles this.
It looks at how the author connects this figure to these bigger ideas of identity, justice, even what makes a community.
Well,
Community.
and this isn't just theoretical. To ground it immediately, the source material starts with a pretty stark look at the reality of trafficked women, specifically in Athens.
Yeah, it highlights the exploitation, but also the really divided public reactions, even some Christian responses. It mentions a specific case.
Oh, the one about the HIV-positive women.
That's the one. Their photos were published online. It's just, it really shows how dehumanizing the perception of these women can become.
Yeah.
So vulnerable.
Absolutely awful. And this leads to the author's central argument, which is quite challenging.
It really is. Instead of seeing someone like a prostitute as completely separate as other Kerns, the source argues that the Bible actually encourages us, maybe even requires us, to identify with that category.
Identify with them. How so?
Well, the idea is that this identification is like a prerequisite for any kind of just approach. It draws parallels to how the Old Testament talks about identifying with other marginalized groups, the alien, the slave,
Okay, so eliminating that otherness is crucial for justice. That makes sense.
Exactly. And the source points to the incarnation, Christ becoming human, as the ultimate example of this. God fully identifying with humanity, bridging that divide completely.
Wow, okay. That's a powerful framing.
It is. And to make sure this doesn't stay abstract, the author introduces us to someone real, a woman named Jenny.
Ah, yes. Jenny's letter.
Yeah, encountered during anti-trafficking work. It takes us right into her lived experience, into a basement brothel. It makes the whole concept very tangible.
Reading her words, it's incredibly moving. She talks about losing her father young, her great love, she called him.
Such a loss.
And then this awful abusive marriage when she was only 14, then another relationship, but his family rejected her.
Just one blow after another.
And now she's trapped in this horrible situation, working off debts for her current true love, still holding on to this dream of marriage, a house, flowers.
That dream, despite everything. It's that core human longing, isn't it? For
Yeah.
love, security, just belonging.
Absolutely. Even when stripped bare, that desire remains. And her story, it really highlights this vulnerability that the whole forsaken woman idea helps us connect with.
Exactly. It shows that beneath all the labels, the circumstances, there's this fundamental human need. And that leads us directly to the biblical metaphor the author explores.
Which is found in Isaiah.
Isaiah 62, yes,
Yeah.
verses 1 to 5. The prophet uses the image of Zion the city, representing God's people, but portrays it as this tormented, forsaken woman with a really painful past.
Okay, Zion as a forsaken woman. But the source emphasizes this isn't just like a random metaphor plucked from thin air.
Not at all. It's rooted in the real experiences of women back then, most likely women who had been abandoned, divorced by their husbands.
Right, and understanding that context is key, isn't it? Divorce in the ancient Near East.
It was complex. I mean, there were recognized grounds, infertility, illness, things like that. But often, husbands had a lot of power. They could divorce for personal reasons, sometimes even just for economic gain.
The source mentioned Deuteronomy 24, trying to regulate it.
It did, but it also points to how vulnerable women could become. Think of Hagar, cast out. That historical vulnerability, it echoes Jenny's situation today, sadly. It's a recurring pattern.
And that vulnerability, that lack of security after a divorce, that's the link back to Jenny, the potential for desperation.
Precisely. The source even brings in Daniel Block's take on Malachi 2.1 since I hate divorce. Block emphasizes how, in that context, divorce often meant economic devastation for the woman.
Pushing them towards prostitution just to survive.
Tragically, yes. So when Isaiah 62.4 says, you shall no more be termed forsaken, it's incredibly powerful.
And the reversal, my delight is in her Hepzibah.
Exactly. That original word, forsaken, azuba, it specifically implies being abandoned by a husband. And desolate, likely ishmima, meant barren.
So this shift isn't just a nice phrase.
No, it's a profound declaration. It's about restoring affection, fruitfulness, worth, belonging. It's not just a name change, it's a status change, a restoration.
And the author really highlights Isaiah's role here, his ability to truly see and identify with the suffering of this forsaken woman.
Yes, that identification is what leads to compassion. It's not detached pity. It's recognizing shared humanity, understanding this abandoned state isn't how things are meant to be.
And that makes the forsaken woman a parable of Israel, a way for the people to see themselves.
That's the idea, to see their own brokenness, their own need for redemption reflected in her story.
And the author then extends this, makes it contemporary, suggests that trafficked women today are like living parables.
Yes, reflecting that same brokenness, that same deep longing for restoration, not just within themselves, but maybe within the church, within all of humanity.
It puts the spotlight on that core salvation story, the forsaken one finding restoration.
And the source gets specific about Zion's forsakenness, too. It wasn't just about external enemies.
Isaiah portrays Zion as disgraced, right?
Right.
Even compared it to Sodom and Gomorrah.
He did, because it had sought false security, become defiled, God's presence felt distant. But, and this is crucial, the focus isn't really on blame.
It's on the devastation and the promise of reversal.
Exactly. The devastation endured, and the promise that God will step in as a defender, not an accuser. That's really clear in Isaiah 62:8.
So even with that harsh picture of Zion's failure, the emphasis is on vulnerability and God's defense. How does that help us understand the forsaken woman?
It underlines that being forsaken isn't about being inherently worthless. It's a state of abandonment, of vulnerability. The comparison to Sodom just shows the depth of that state, making God's eventual rescue even more dramatic.
Okay, and the renaming you mentioned earlier.
Hugely significant. The author links it to ancient marriage ceremonies. A new name meant a new status, a new belonging.
Which connects back to trafficked women sometimes using different names.
Right, as a defense mechanism, a way to protect their true identity from the degradation. So for God to give Zion a new name.
It's like declaring her true identity, overriding the history of shame.
Precisely. The source mentions Naomi becoming Mara in the book of Ruth, a name change reflecting immense suffering and altered life. God's renaming of Zion is a radical break from that past oppression.
This is really building a powerful picture. And then the argument takes another step.
It does, a very compelling one.
Yeah.
That the forsaken woman's story actually becomes a kind of parable of the Son of God.
Of Christ's life.
Yes, underscoring his complete identification with the forsaken. Think about it. Rejection by his own people, betrayal by a close friend.
And ultimately being abandoned on the cross.
That cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? It takes on such depth viewed through this lens, doesn't it?
It really does.
And yet, as the source points out, that moment of apparent total abandonment, total forsakenness, was paradoxically the path to victory, to resurrection, to his true royal status being affirmed despite the mockery.
Wow. So the ultimate forsakenness leads to the ultimate restoration.
And the author connects that narrative right back to the church, saying that the church, Christ's body, might sometimes look forsaken to the world.
But it shares that same story, that potential for restoration.
Exactly. There's a quote from Luther mentioned about this church appearing like a harlot, but being seen by God in the Word as a bride, Hephzibah, Beulah. It captures that tension, that paradox.
This whole way of seeing things really seems to depend on the prophet's perspective.
Absolutely. The source emphasizes that the prophet has this complete picture of reality. They can see the present suffering, yes, but interpret it in light of the promised future restoration.
So they don't just accept the suffering as the final word.
No, they refuse to stay silent.
Yeah.
They act as a defender, a living sign of God's presence, even when God seems absent. It's that already and not yet thing the transformation has begun, even if it's not fully visible yet.
And the implication for us today, for the church.
It's pretty clear, isn't it? We've seen the resurrection. We have the ultimate precedent for believing in the restoration of the forsaken. We're called to have that same prophetic vision, that active hope.
Which brings us back to the practical response, to issues like trafficking.
Right. And the source makes a really critical point here. Simply freeing someone, physically freeing them, while absolutely necessary, it's not enough.
It's not the end goal.
No. True freedom, lasting freedom, requires more. It requires a change in their sense of self, requires them embracing a new story, a new narrative about who they are.
This source is a bit critical of just charity.
It critiques charity that comes from a position of privilege, suggesting it can sometimes, unintentionally, keep the very inequalities in place.
There's that challenging line, only the once forsaken owes charity to the forsaken.
Powerful, isn't it? It pushes us beyond sympathy from a distance toward real identification, real solidarity, equal access to restoration.
So the core of it is helping women rediscover their identity, not as forsaken, but
As God's delight,
yeah,
Hepzibah, helping them see their inherent worth, that deep redefinition, that's what has the power to break the psychological, the emotional chains of exploitation.
like Paul wanting to present the church as a pure bride to Christ.
Exactly. The author draws that parallel. It's the same vision. Restoring dignity, recognizing inherent worth.
So, wrapping this up, it's clear the source draws this incredibly powerful line connecting the personal pain of the forsaken woman to these huge themes: identity, suffering, hope, restoration, on every level, really, personal and communal.
It really does. And it leaves us, you, the listener, with a pretty compelling question to wrestle with, I think.
Which is,
Well, how might really understanding this biblical metaphor, the forsaken woman, how might that challenge our own views, our perceptions of people on the margins, people who feel abandoned?
and maybe inspire action that goes beyond just writing a check.
Exactly. Towards real identification, towards actively working for restored identity, restored dignity for everyone. Maybe we can all look around and see the living parables near us.
And think about what part we play in their story of restoration.
Yeah, something to definitely reflect on.